Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're in the United States. My name is Robert Giuffra. I'm the co-chair of the American Swiss Foundation, and it's my privilege and honor to welcome you to the 25th edition of ASF Connect. We started these connections back during the COVID period, about 2 years ago, and hopefully we're moving to the end of the COVID period. We have a really special presentation today on cyber resilience. And our speaker is my good friend, Sergio Ermotti. Sergio is one of the great business leaders of Switzerland and, in fact, the world. Many of you may know Sergio from time from 2011 until very recently when he was the CEO of UBS, and he did a fantastic job steering UBS out of the financial crisis and maintaining UBS as one of the great financial institutions of the world. Sergio has had a remarkable career. He is now the chairman of the board of Swiss Re, one of the leading reinsurers and one of Switzerland's leading corporations. He started out originally as an apprentice at a bank. He had wanted to become a soccer player and a skier, and he literally worked his way up. And again, there have even been speculation, although Sergio's denied it, that Sergio might be go get involved in politics, but I don't think so. Also, I wanted to welcome my good friend and partner, Markus Diethelm, co-chair of the American Swiss Foundation. Markus was general counsel of UBS, and he and Sergio just did a fantastic job guiding the bank for many years. Markus was also general counsel of Swiss Re. So we're really looking forward to hearing from both of them. Before we start the program, I wanted to mention that we had 100 people register for this program. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, Q&A type questions, put them in the Q&A chat, and Markus, who is going to be leading the discussion, will decide which ones to start. So without further ado, I hand it over to Sergio Ermotti. And Sergio, thank you so much for doing this. We are absolutely delighted to hear from you.
Thank you, Bob, and for the kind words. And it's great to be here. So welcome. Good afternoon. Good morning to everybody. So you see from the title, cyber resilience is a vital concept in today's world, and cyber risk have been an important topic for quite some time now. But the COVID pandemic and the Russia's invasion of Ukraine have made them even more prominent. So working virtual like we do today from home office and the use of the internet for a much broader range of services have increased exposure and dependency on technology. And in today's world, whenever there is a conflict, we expect cyber operations to accompany them, from classic espionage to disrupting operations, psychological warfare, and misinformation. So you might remember NotPetya in 2017. This malware was hidden in accounting software and also targeted Ukraine. The attack has been attributed to Russian actors by several countries. This malware spread like wildfire and within hours had infected computers and networks all over the world. To date, the costliest single cyber event with an estimated $10 billion of economic damage. Companies, critical infrastructure like hospitals, and public authorities suffered data losses and days, if not weeks, of business interruption. NotPetya was a wake-up call for many and surprised the world with how fast it spread and how many companies and institutions from different sectors were severely impacted. That brought to the forefront two facts that many people had not been aware of or were underestimating. Number one, that the business world is incredibly interconnected, and the second is that the digitalization of business processes is already so advanced that many companies cannot function when data or systems are not available. The NotPetya outbreak was definitely an event which highlighted the importance of cyber resilience. One of the most important principles in cyber is that there is no 100% security. If you honor that principle, you understand that you not only have to protect yourself against cyber risks, but also be prepared for an event to happen. So cyber resilience is an organization's ability to deliver business services despite adverse cyber events. This capacity to deliver must be comprehensive and also include the supply chain. To maintain cyber resilience, the organization must have a formal information security program, a dedicated team, and governance system that are integrated with the risk, crisis, business continuity, and education programs. As digital risk becomes business #1 risk, cyber resilience becomes vital for all organizations. You might wonder at first why I feel so strongly about this. Well, the insurance industry is very much involved in this question, and as the chairman of Swiss Re, one of the largest reinsurer of the world, I like to concentrate the following on what role insurance can play in the cyber resilience of organizations. I want to start with another important principle. Insurance can be part of the solution, is not the sole solution. This part that insurance plays can be important though. Here is why. Number one, insurance can assume the financial impact from these risks. Number two, insurance can deliver concrete cyber risk management services. And number three, insurance can help increase overall cyber maturity. Let me explain the first one. Assuming the financial impact of typical insurance, what is actually covered by cyber insurance? Cyber insurance covers risks that emanate from issues with the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of data. One important coverage is liability for data privacy breaches. Companies that store or process personally identifiable information have an obligation to keep that information confidential and secure. If the data is stolen and published, the company is liable for this. In that case, the cyber insurance would cover potential payments to the affected persons, legal and process costs, notification costs, and the setup of call center if necessary, as well as credit monitoring costs in some jurisdictions. Availability of data is key for any digitalized process. If data is not available, for example, due to a ransomware attack where attackers encrypt the data and only release the key after ransom is paid, a prolonged business interruption may ensue. Cyber insurance covers the lost business during this interruption and costs for getting operation up and running again. I also need to mention what is not usually insured. One impact of a cyber event may be a lot of negative publicity. This reputational risk cannot be reliably quantified and thus cannot be insured. There are few reputational risk covers in the market, but they mainly support actions that mitigate the risk rather than paying out for the direct reputational hit that a company has taken. The second topic I covered and mentioned was risk management services. So many cyber insurance products include services that help the insureds to actively manage through a cyber event. This can be incident response services that are often delivered by a specialized company on behalf of the insurer. If an insured company is hit by a cyber event, they can call an hotline and receive direct help, like IT forensic services or crisis management support. Other services might be of a more preemptive character, for example, employee trainings that can be rolled out to the organization. And the third topic I mentioned was increasing the overall cyber maturity. This is a very different but not less important factor. that includes that the base requirements that insurer ask to their insureds. Those requirements can be formulated during the risk assessment process before the insurance policy is issued, or they are included in the policy itself as obligations that the insured needs to fulfill during the policy term. In the past, many people have pointed to insurer to increase the overall cyber maturity by generating quasi-security standards for the market. However, with a very soft insurance market and ample risk capacity available, this mechanism did not work for some time. Today, we are in a different world, and insurers are asking for better protection and preparedness before insuring a risk. So you can see how cyber insurance goes beyond pure risk transfer and contributes directly to organizational risk management and cyber resilience. Now, often the question comes up, which events or situations are insured? Cyber insurance is usually quite broad with respect to insured events. When talking about cyber risk, one often has this picture of a hooded occurs in one's mind, sitting in a darkened room and hacking into a company's network. While malicious attacks are certainly an important risk vector, cyber risk also results from human or system errors. There are numerous examples where companies or even healthcare providers accidentally published customer or patient data by pure mistake and thus created a data privacy event. An exception is war. War is typically excluded in property, and the same is true for cyber insurance. The reason for this is that the damage potential in the event of war is so high that it exceeds the financial might of the private insurance industry, and insurance policy would simply be too expensive if this risk was properly priced in. The big problem here is recognizing and acknowledging cyber war as such. This usually requires attribution to a state, and as we know, this is not always easy or even possible. In conclusion, cyber risks are a reality and will develop in the future. Insurance can help manage those risks and contribute to organizational, but also on a larger scale to societal cyber resilience. So many thanks, and I look forward to the question, Markus.
Thank you very much, Sergio, for this very comprehensive overview. If you look at a typical insurance business, the basis is risk diversification. So the wind doesn't blow and the earth doesn't shake everywhere at the same time. So you pay out claims and you make premiums around the globe, and it's risk diversified. Given your example of NotPetya, you know, cyber attacks transcend national borders, go like a wildfire. So the first question is, does it matter whether for the insurance, if a company was targeted specifically, or there was collateral damage? In other words, what difference does it make for the insurer if you look at, you know, this global event, which is really quite unusual in terms of natural disasters? So we have a new phenomena of you know, maybe difficulty in risk diversifying that.
Oh no, I think that, you know, the answer is no, and in the vast majority of cases, it doesn't really matter whether the company is specifically targeted or whether it was hit by let's call it an accident or as a collateral damage of a widespread malware. Like, you know, if you look at most impacted companies in the NotPetya were the case. So I mean, potentially the attackers were focusing on a specific set of factors. You know, as I mentioned, it was suspicious or the attributions that the attackers wanted to go after Ukraine. But the spreading of the malware also affected the rest of the world. Not that those people would probably care about, but that's clearly from an insurance standpoint of view. If you are insured, it doesn't matter if it's collateral damage or, you know, you were the subject of the attack.
So a few reports estimate the cost of cybercrime to over $1 trillion. And if I listen to your earlier remarks, increasing probably and not decreasing. The digital world becomes riskier, more interconnected. What impact does that have for insurance?
Well, I mean, there is always, when I started to look into those kind of topics, joining Swiss Re was quite interesting to see. I mean, you mentioned the trillion, and actually the cyber insurance market is only 8 billion of premium. So think about for a second the damage that is done out there through cyber risks, whatever, right? Intentional or intentional. We expect this business to grow a lot in the future, but it's very minor still in terms of what is now. What we see more and more now, particularly in the last 3 years, and the correlation and the acceleration of cyber risk with the COVID environment is quite clear. In the last 3 years, we see claims coming up a lot, coming from different angles. But the most important one is definitely the one of criminal groups that are discovering an easy way to, de facto demand money. And as we know, there is also, to some extent, they are facilitated by the fact that one way to get the ransom is to use cryptocurrencies as a way of asking money and making it harder to trace and which down the cyber attacker. Now, I mean, we see all in the recent developments, the FBI was also able to track down eventually where the money went, but definitely, the environment in the last few years has changed dramatically because the system is changing and more people are using digital channels. And as I said, there is also a tool that make it easier for people to evade the anti-money laundering controls for such events.
So we have a question on a scale of 1 to 10. How would you rate the cybersecurity matureness of big companies and also small and medium enterprises in the US and Switzerland? Which is, of course, very, very difficult to answer. And before you go into the answer, maybe a little bit of an overview of how the cyber market looks like. And by market, I mean the peril, the insurance peril, the attackers, and the people on the defense side. So the listeners can have a view. You talked about the guy with the hoodie in a black room from some foreign place, but can you give us a view of how you see the market on the attack and the defense side, and then maybe just an assessment or a guess on maturity?
Yeah, I mean, the first one is quite difficult because I think that's of course, looking at our own data and the standards that have been developed in the industry, also being part of a large organizations and talking to many peers. I would say that probably if you go back 3 to 5 years ago on a scale 1 to 10, the awareness was on average, right? So on average, probably was a 5, 6. I would say that there is a big difference between risk awareness and being risk prepared, truly prepared. So the question is more about how prepared. I don't know how prepared people are, but I would say that in terms of awareness, we probably moved into the mid-single digits towards the 7, 8. Or even more in terms of awareness. But are people really prepared? Are people really doing everything that is needed to do that? And in some cases, I think this is more difficult to achieve because of different limitations. It takes time to roll out programs, to make investments. It takes time to, most importantly, to educate people because at the end of the day, you have different, and I'm going to touch on the second part of the question, but I mean, there is also an element that, you know, many of those attacks and incidents are made more easier by people, and the education of the single user, and is probably one of the most important issues. So the culture of risk management around cyber and the sensitivity takes time. And you know, humankind, this is my theory, but you know, I always believe that being in business, in life, in politics, you know, we always see that humankind always needs some kind of bad event to really realize and respond. You know, people don't like to take too many proactive actions if they don't, you know, or if they are not directly touched with a problem. And so, but I think in the last few years, also, to be honest, regulators, policymakers, not only in the financial services industry, which is clear, but also policymakers around the world, when looking at infrastructure critical services and like electricity, power, and so on, they have been very focused on regulating and mandating clear standards on how to achieve that. So, so when you look at the actors in the market, you know, I don't think I'm saying anything new to the people here listening, but you know, the usual one is you go from the single people trying to attack for the fun of showing that they are smarter than, you know, any of the cyber defense of any governments or companies, to the people who are doing it with a aim to show a political reason or a moral reason, you know, attacking. You know, we see nowadays some attackers going in different directions to companies or states to punish for moral reasons. You know, I mentioned the criminal group, which is probably the most active in that sense that we can see in terms of public knowledge and coverage. And then the last one, which is the most difficult, I mentioned, to track and to prove, but it's definitely part of the equation in any dimension, is the states doing that for either you know, the cyber war or espionage or any other matter. So that's more the attacking part. When you talk about defense, I guess on defense you have, you know, as I mentioned, I do believe that the organizations are part of the equation, and so starting from each single user to, you know, the board, down to, up to the board of directors, that has to have a culture that looks at this matter in a comprehensive way, and looks at putting policies in place and making sure that people do follow policies. Then the tech companies are there, being the big security and cyber companies that are helping through softwares to prevent or at least make it harder for people to attack, but also tech companies themselves, which also have a kind of mandate to embed into their software packages, you know, ways to make it very difficult to avoid having loopholes, and also because, by the way, if you I'm sure we all know that if a big software provider is subject to an attack, or an attack is done because of shortcomings in the software of a company, the reputational damage on that company, it's huge. So they have all the interest to be involved. And lastly, I think that states are very big players in that sense. I mentioned before the offensive part of the equation, but states are also very much now is part in many countries. Cyber is part of now of defense, so it's like recognized as a defense, like the traditional military is now also complemented with cyber defense.
So thank you. When you referred to earlier on as an act of war not being insured, and you just said a moment ago, traditional military, war today in the cyberspace, of course, is not defined as a conflict between two nations. It's way more complicated. The question is whether terrorism is covered. The question is, how can you define or how can you know who is the perpetrator? There's always a speculation as to where it may come from, but it's not like a well-recognized plane of an enemy flying over the country. So it's getting very, very complicated to determine whether it's actually covered or not covered. But if you could speak about, acts of terrorism to the extent you can define them and whether it's covered or not.
Yeah, I guess, Markus, I mean, your question almost answered, because you know that, I mean, as I mentioned before, it's almost impossible. And also because it's almost impossible because, of course, the attackers are not, in those kind of situations are not officially probably coming from a predefined location that is identifiable as a public and recognized public place. So, I mean, even if you track down exactly, if you are able to say, okay, this is coming from that country, you have to prove that in that building, all the people doing that were state employed people. So, or employed by the military service. So,
I remember an effort by Brad Smith, who's the chairman of Microsoft, and a friend of mine, to expand the Geneva Convention and the definition of acts of wars to the cyber world. But it's proven to be extremely difficult how we define it, because you simply don't know, even when it hits you.
I'm not an expert, but maybe through I know I heard in the past that through triangulations people can narrow down and can probably narrow down or try to come back to the sources of certain places and then come to the conclusion. In some cases, ego helps, because in some cases people are talking and or making statements that may help to indicate that the source was coming from a certain country versus another. But it's very difficult. Of course, the assumption is that in certain countries, I would say probably in all countries, it's quite naive to think that all the people are only there to defend.
Yep.
So some people may also be attackers, because there are no permanent defense. If you have a defense, it means somebody's attacking.
Exactly. Could you give the listeners some examples where cyber risk had a significant impact on an organization? I mean, we all pick it up from the press, but given that Swiss Re probably has, almost the totality of information, just a few examples of recent times.
Well, I think I mentioned in my remarks not PTIA one but the most probably the one that we can remember was the one in the US with the Colonial pipeline. Yeah, when was it? In May, 2 years. 18 months ago or so. I mean, that was quite a wake-up call in respect of what it meant, because it was not just about eventually getting the money, and they were able to get the money. And this is where the FBI, by the way, managed to track down the payments eventually. But that created a severe fuel shortage in the southwest of the USA for several days. Now, can you imagine, by the way, if something like that would happen today in this environment, on a pipeline or on a more broader scale, being on oil or electricity and any supply of energy, you can see how exponential this risk can be when it's coming on top of existing existing tensions or shortages of energy. And this is where coming back to the topic of war and so is where cyber risk becomes almost impossible to in certain cases to assess and in some cases even to ensure because that's where the private sector can definitely not capture all that. So there's plenty of examples out there. I don't think that the big one are not so many, but in order to make if we go back into the trillion we discussed before, it takes maybe a lot of small events that can sum up very quickly.
So when you talk about the individual companies, the private sector, it is clear that not any single firm, no matter how sophisticated, can deal with all of it. And we all know that there's collaboration and cooperation among firms. But the question I would like to ask is sort of the interaction between the public and the private sector and our dependencies on national cybersecurity centers, FBI, etc., how it actually works. So all of that can be tackled, including regulators, of course, in the most forceful, coordinated way as best as possible.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important topic because at the end of the day, this issue of cyber, no matter what is the intention, have a probability to go beyond the national borders or the individual sectors and industries. So, in that sense, the most important topic that I felt was also important, that I felt was important as not as an insurance company, but also as an insurance company, but even before was twofold. One was how to work with peers and other companies with similar risks and exposures. And there, it's not easy because at that stage, now I think is better, but at that stage, working together with other industries or banks and financial institution in talking about not necessarily preemptively, but after an attack about some things was seen as a little bit of a problematic issue. The stigma around being attacked and being aware that you were exposed to such an attack prevented at the very beginning a lot of discussions. Today, this is more normal, and I think also the fact that in many jurisdictions, governments are quite active in bringing together industries, in advising, in giving intelligence, in contributing to resilience, has made the situation easier. By the way, I mean, this is something that's also considering the group attending this call, being part of the American Swiss Foundation is noteworthy to note that Switzerland and the US are working at official levels around the topic with the establishment of national cybersecurity centers capability that work together, and this is very important. So you can see how within a country, public, private, but also more and more on a international basis, it's very important to exchange best practices.
So thank you very much for this pitch line here, Sergio, because I was going to make the comment, because the American Swiss Foundation's purpose is to get very smart, proven leaders together and to continue a dialogue. And oftentimes it's not happening through the ordinary channels of the IT people. It's happening from all sorts of corners, and therefore we're grateful to have this wonderful group together and for you to speak to us. So the final question, I know that we're getting a little tight on time, is given natural catastrophes, given terrible situations that we see on television every day, and the risk of cyber attacks, is insurance still a good business?
Yeah, well, looks like yeah, I managed to get into a sector that is going through some changes, but yes, the answer is yes. I mean, if you look at maybe to start with this, one of the characteristics I haven't mentioned about the cyber risk is that it's not so easy to diversify for the reason we mentioned before. It spreads very quickly outside geography, and therefore you don't get for example, in NatCat or in other events, the benefits of diversification. But if you look at the insurance sector, I think that you still you're right in looking at the picture nowadays. It doesn't look good from an economic, but also from a risk standpoint of view. There is a huge trend of social inflation, litigations, NatCat events, big NatCats, but also what so-called secondary perils are developing more and more. And there is a life and health concerns. COVID has created a huge awareness on health and the protection needs. So from an insurer standpoint of view, many people may know here, but it's almost like when people are more risk aware, it's a good time for insurance.
Yeah.
The bad times for insurance is when people believe that there are no risks, and therefore you create oversupply of capital in the business. So right now, I do see that. I see GDP growth in the world, and particularly in countries where you have people coming out of poverty, going into the middle class, and even higher up. They have wealth, they have a house, they have some things to insure. So there is an embedded growth. I think that the underlying risk that I mentioned at the beginning will make sure that the insurance will continue to grow. We expect that Swiss Re in the next 10 to 20 years, the insurance industry will grow at least as much as GDP, if not more. I mean, and better data management, better capability to assess risk will make also our business easier to assess. But of course, like in reinsurance is a much more volatile business than any other financial services business. But hopefully over time, this is then compensated by above average returns on capital deployed.
No, I remember your predecessor, Walter Kielholz, sometimes having said that when the premiums, the premiums softened, a natural catastrophe will harden it again. But given what we just talked about, it seems, and the awareness and, social media, that everyone knows about everything that goes wrong around the world. And then you add to that demographics and building of wealth. It seems you have, as always, made a good move and a smart move to go from banking into insurance. That concludes the program. I'm doing what I cannot do as charmingly as Patricia does by ending the program. Patricia apologizes. She has not COVID, just has a tough voice. So I want to thank you, Sergio, for taking the time. I want to thank all the listeners to attend. And remember that all good ideas come about because when a multitude of people with diverse backgrounds and from different nations talk to each other, usually something good comes out of it. Sergio, you've been fantastic. I want to personally thank you for all the time we were able to work together, and it was therefore a personal pleasure to ask you questions. And with that, we end the conference. I wish everyone...
You got your revenge.
Yes.
Instead of me asking you questions, now you ask me.
No, I know.
That's good. Well, many thanks. Thanks for having me, and all the best to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye.